Have you ever felt completely ignored, like your voice doesn't matter? Imagine being 80 years old, frail and tormented day and night by people who want you gone. You plead for help, but everyone just laughs. This is the story of Arthur, a man pushed to his breaking point. It's a story about how a single faded photograph can shatter years of silence and expose a truth that will change everything. Prepare for a story of hidden heroism, shocking betrayal, and a final act of justice that you won't see coming. Arthur Miller was 80 years old and lived in the same rent-controlled Chicago apartment for half a century. It was a quiet third-floor walk-up in Lincoln Park, filled with the ghosts of a happier life. His wife, Eleanor, had been gone for 20 years, her heart giving out shortly after they received the folded flag. Their son, Michael, their only child, had died a hero in the mountains of Afghanistan. Arthur, a retired history teacher, now spent his days surrounded by books and memories. The building, once full of families he knew, had changed. Young professionals moved in, and with them came a different kind of noise. But nothing could have prepared him for Jessica and Kyle, the couple who moved in next door 3 months ago. Their lives were a constant party, a storm of loud music and drunken laughter that bled through the thin walls, turning Arthur's sanctuary into a prison. The bass vibrated through the floorboards, a relentless physical assault. It wasn't just noise, it was a presence. Arthur felt it in his teeth, in the rattling of his late wife's porcelain teacups on the shelf. It was 2 a.m. Again, he had tried knocking on the wall earlier. A gentle tap, tap, tap with his cane. The music had only gotten louder, punctuated by a woman's shrill, mocking laughter. He sighed, the sound lost in the electronic beat. His heart fluttered nervously, a frightened bird in his ribcage. With a grunt of effort, he pushed himself up from his worn armchair, his joints protesting, with a chorus of cracks and groans. He slipped on his old robe, the fabric thin and soft from countless washings. His slippers shuffled across the hardwood floor, a sound of quiet desperation against the thunder from next door. He opened his door to the dim, stale air of the hallway and faced their door, steeling himself for the inevitable confrontation. This couldn't go on. He was just an old man who wanted to sleep. He pressed the doorbell, the chime swallowed by the pulsating music inside. He pressed it again, holding it down. Finally, the door creaked open a few inches. A young woman, Jessica, peered out. Her makeup was smeared, her eyes glassy. A cloud of sickly sweet vape smoke and stale beer smell billowed into the hall. "What do you want, old man?" she slurred, her voice dripping with annoyance. Arthur clutched the collar of his robe. "Jessica, it's after 2 in the morning," he said, his own voice sounding frail and thin. "I can't sleep. Could you please turn the music down?" She let out a sharp, ugly laugh. "He can't sleep," she yelled over her shoulder into the apartment. "Hey, Kyle, Artie can't get his beauty rest." A mountain of a man, Kyle, appeared behind her. He was shirtless, with a smug grin plastered on his face. He leaned against the doorframe, towering over Arthur. "Having trouble sleeping, buddy?" Kyle smirked, his words thick with alcohol. "Maybe you need some warm milk, or a shot of bourbon. That'll put you right out. You'll sleep like a baby." Jessica giggled, a sound that grated on Arthur's frayed nerves. Kyle's eyes were cold and dismissive. He saw Arthur not as a person, a neighbour, but as an inconvenience, a relic to be brushed aside. The humiliation burned in Arthur's chest, hotter than his indigestion. Without another word, Kyle slammed the door in his face. The latch clicked with a deafening finality. The music seemed to surge, louder and more defiant than before. Arthur stood alone in the dim hallway, the vibrations from the floor travelling up his legs. He felt a profound weariness settle over him, a bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. He turned and shuffled back to his own apartment, the weight of his 80 years pressing down on him. Back inside, he swallowed a calming pill, something his doctor warned him not to overdo. He lay in bed, pulling the thick quilt over his head to muffle the relentless beat. The noise was only part of the problem. His other neighbour's apartment was empty, for sale. The elderly couple downstairs were so hard of hearing, they probably slept through thunderstorms. He was alone on this battlefield. He had called the police twice. By the time a squad car ambled over, the party would be quiet, the lights dimmed. The officers would give him a tired, patronising look and tell him to try and work it out with his neighbours. Jessica had started leaving cigarette butts and empty beer cans by his welcome mat, a small, daily act of aggression. He had spoken to the building's management company, a faceless entity that sent him a generic email about promoting a harmonious living environment. There was no harmony. There was only the thumping bass and the slow, grinding erosion of his peace. He eventually drifted into a restless sleep, his mind escaping into the familiar, comforting landscape of the past. He was young again, standing in a sun-drenched park with his Eleanor. Her laugh was like wind chimes. Their son Michael was there, a boy with a shock of sandy hair and a gap-toothed grin, chasing a soccer ball across the grass. These dreams were his only solace, a sanctuary where his family was still whole. Eleanor, gone 20 years now. Her heart, the doctors said, had simply broken after they got the news about Michael. It couldn't bear the weight of a world without their son in it. The dream shifted, the park fading. Now he saw Michael as a teenager, his lanky frame radiating determination. He was obsessed with becoming a soldier, just like Arthur's own father, who had died on the beaches of Normandy. "I'm going to West Point, Dad," Michael had announced at the dinner table one evening. He had the grades, the athleticism, the unwavering focus, but the competition was fierce. He missed the cut by a razor-thin margin on his first try. Arthur saw the disappointment flicker in his son's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a steely resolve. "It doesn't matter," Michael said, his jaw set. "I'll still serve. I'll enlist." And he did. He served his term, an exemplary soldier. Most boys would have come home satisfied, but not Michael. As soon as he was out, he applied to the military academy again. This time, he got in. Pride swelled in Arthur's chest, so immense it almost hurt, but he could see the quiet terror in Eleanor's eyes. "Michael, honey, being an officer, it's dangerous," Eleanor would say, her hands twisting a dish towel. "Things can happen." Michael would just laugh his easy, confident laugh. "Mom, relax. We live in peaceful times. My job will be to train good soldiers, to lead them. It's an honour." Arthur, the history teacher, knew better than anyone that peaceful times were an illusion, a brief pause between conflicts. But he also believed in duty, in honour, in the legacy of his own father. "Your grandfather would be so proud, son," Arthur told him, clapping him on the shoulder. "You're carrying on a tradition of service. Just be careful. Promise me you'll be careful." Michael grinned. "Don't worry, Dad. I'll be fine. I promise." It was a promise he couldn't keep. The news report started as a low hum in the background of their lives, then grew into a roar, a new conflict, a hot spot in a distant, dusty country. Michael, a freshly minted second lieutenant, was deployed almost immediately after graduation. His letters were infrequent and heavily censored, full of reassurances that everything was fine, that they shouldn't worry. Then the letters stopped. For 6 months, there was only silence, a thick, heavy silence that filled their small apartment and choked the air. Arthur made daily calls to the recruitment office to any number he could find. The answers were always the same: bureaucratic, impersonal, and unhelpful. "Information is on a need-to-know basis, sir. No news is good news." But it wasn't good news. It was a terrifying void. The doorbell rang on a Tuesday afternoon, not the loud, demanding buzz of a delivery, but a soft, hesitant chime. Eleanor opened the door. 2 soldiers stood on their welcome mat, their dress uniforms immaculate, their faces grim and impossibly young. One of them, a captain, held his hat in his hands. He cleared his throat. "Mrs. Miller, I'm here on behalf of the Secretary of the Army." He didn't need to finish. The world tilted on its axis. The words that followed were a blur. "Acted with conspicuous gallantry. Killed in action while defending his position. Posthumously awarded Arthur wrapped his arms around Eleanor as she began to crumble, a silent, wrenching collapse. The officer held out a velvet box containing a medal. They didn't see it. All they saw was the gaping hole that had just been torn in their lives. That night, Eleanor was rushed to the hospital. By morning she was gone, a mother's heart shattered by grief. Arthur buried her on a grey, overcast day. He remembered looking up and seeing a flock of geese flying south in a perfect V formation. It felt like Eleanor and Michael leaving him behind. That was 20 years ago. The sharp edges of the pain had dulled, but the ache remained, a constant companion. Over the years he had become the keeper of Michael's memory. Students from his old school would visit, listening raptly as he spoke of his son's courage. Local journalists had interviewed him for Memorial Day articles. He would show them the medals, the Silver Star, and the Purple Heart, polished and displayed in a glass case. But now his life had shrunk to the four walls of his apartment, and the greatest battle he faced was the nightly siege from next door. He remembered Catherine, Jessica's mother. She had grown up in this building. She and Michael had been inseparable in high school. Arthur and Eleanor had always assumed they would end up together. They would watch from the window as the two of them walked through the park across the street, their heads close together. Then shortly after Michael left for West Point, Catherine suddenly married a wealthy businessman and moved to the suburbs. Not long after, Jessica was born. Eleanor, in her grief, once saw a picture of the baby and was struck by a fleeting resemblance. She had whispered to Catherine once, gently, if there was any chance the baby was Michael's. Catherine had exploded in a furious denial, cutting off all contact. She didn't even come to Eleanor's funeral. 2 years ago, Catherine and her husband had died in a car crash. Jessica inherited the apartment, and she seemed to have inherited her mother's strange, baseless animosity towards him, twisting it into a cruel sport. The doorbell buzzed, a sharp, insistent sound that pierced through Arthur's drowsy state. He glanced at the clock, 3:30 a.m. He groaned, his body aching as he swung his legs out of bed. He shuffled to the door, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anger. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice hoarse. "Mr. Miller, it's me, Jessica," came the sickly sweet, drunken reply. "I was wondering, do you have a corkscrew? We can't find ours." The audacity of it stole his breath. "No!" he snapped. "Go to bed, Jessica, or I swear I'm calling the police right now." He heard her laugh through the door, a high-pitched mocking sound. "Ooh, I'm so scared. You've called them before, they don't care." Frustration and rage boiled inside him. He wrenched the door open. "What is wrong with you?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "Why do you feel the need to torment me like this every single night?" Jessica leaned against the doorframe, a venomous smirk on her face. The alcohol had stripped away any pretense of civility. "You really want to know? The honest-to-God truth," she hissed, her voice low and conspiratorial. Arthur stared at her, bewildered. "I want to expand," she said, her eyes gleaming with a greedy light. "Kyle already bought the empty unit on the other side. You're the only thing in the way. We want the whole floor. So tell me, old man, when are you planning on kicking the bucket? Because you're really holding up our renovation plans." The words hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't just thoughtlessness. It was a calculated, malevolent campaign to drive him out. Or worse. They were waiting for him to die. He felt a chill creep over his skin that had nothing to do with the drafty hallway. He stared at the young woman's face, twisted by greed and alcohol, and felt a profound sense of shock. He slammed the door, his hands trembling violently. That was it. He was done being a victim. The next morning, running on fumes and righteous anger, Arthur put on his best coat and took the bus to the 19th District Police Station on North Clark Street. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. A young, bored-looking officer sat behind a high plexiglass shield. "Can I help you?" he asked without looking up from his computer screen. I need to file a report," Arthur said, his voice trembling slightly. "Against my neighbours." The officer who had responded to his previous calls, a weary, cynical man named O'Malley, happened to be walking by. He recognized Arthur instantly. "Ah, Mr. Miller. Back again? Did the kids next door play their music too loud for you?" he said, with a condescending chuckle. "They are trying to kill me," Arthur said, the words tumbling out. "They told me they're waiting for me to die so they can take my apartment." O'Malley rolled his eyes and let out an exasperated sigh. "Sir, with all due respect, that's a bit much, don't you think?" He turned to the desk sergeant. "This guy calls us every other week. We go out there, and it's quiet as a mouse. He's just got a thing against his young neighbours." Arthur's face burned with humiliation. They saw him as a crazy old man, a nuisance. "You take too long to arrive," he insisted. "Please, just let me file a formal complaint." "I need to speak with the detective," O'Malley smirked. "Sure, Gramps. Go talk to the desk sergeant. He'll get you the paperwork." He gave the sergeant a subtle look, a quick nod that clearly meant, humour him and get rid of him. O'Malley then turned and walked away, leaving Arthur feeling more helpless and invisible than ever before. Arthur sat at a small table, his old-fashioned glasses perched on the end of his nose. His hand shook as he painstakingly filled out the complaint form, the pen feeling heavy and foreign. He described the nightly noise, the harassment, the threats. Each word felt inadequate to convey the psychological torment he was enduring. When he finished, he handed the form to the young desk sergeant. The officer glanced at it, his expression a mask of practiced indifference. "Okay, Mr. Miller, we'll look into this. We'll be in touch," he said in a monotone voice. "You're sure a detective will see this?" Arthur asked, a note of desperation in his voice. "Absolutely. It'll go right on his desk. They're all out on calls right now, but we'll make sure it gets to the right person." Arthur nodded, wanting to believe him. He turned and walked out of the station, the cold Chicago wind hitting him like a slap in the face. As soon as the door closed, the desk sergeant crumpled the form and tossed it into the trash can beneath his desk. Just another crank. A week passed. The nights were just as loud, the harassment just as cruel. The silence from the police was absolute. Arthur called the station to follow up. A different officer answered. "A complaint from an Arthur Miller?" the officer said, a rustling of papers in the background. "Oh, yeah, right. The detective is actively working on your case. It's a high priority. We'll call you when we have an update." Arthur had lived long enough to recognize a lie when he heard one. He hung up the phone, a cold knot of despair tightening in his stomach. That night it got worse. He was startled awake not by music, but by a whisper, a sibilant hiss coming from his front door. "Hey, old man, your time is up. They're waiting for you on the other side." It was Jessica, her voice a drunken, venomous whisper through the mail slot. Arthur's blood ran cold. He lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, his heart hammering against his ribs. The next morning, he went back to the station. He was beyond exhaustion, beyond fear. All that was left was a raw, desperate anger. The lobby was bustling with officers coming in for their morning briefing. He tried to stop one, then another, but they all brushed past him, their minds on other, more important things. He ended up back in front of the same desk sergeant from the week before. "You again," the officer said, not even trying to hide his annoyance. "Look, I told you, we're handling it. Why don't you go to your doctor and get something for your nerves? Your neighbours are fine people. Officer O'Malley checked them out." "Fine people?" Arthur's voice cracked. "Last night she was whispering death threats through my mail slot." The sergeant threw his hands up. "That's it. Get out of here. Now." "I will not," Arthur declared, his voice rising, drawing stares from across the room. "I am not leaving until I speak to your superior." In the precinct captain's office, a morning briefing was wrapping up. Captain Davis, a man in his late 40s, with a stern but fair reputation, was addressing his senior officers. "By the way," he said, looking up from his notes, "who's the old man who's always in the lobby? I've seen him here a few times this month." The head of patrol, a lieutenant, spoke up. "Oh, that's just a local character. Arthur Miller. Thinks his neighbours are trying to murder him for his apartment." Captain Davis raised an eyebrow. "And are they?" No, Captain. O'Malley checked it out. They're a young couple, maybe a little noisy sometimes, but that's it. The old guy's probably just lonely and a little paranoid. All right, Davis said, though a flicker of unease crossed his face. Just make sure we're not dropping the ball on this. Before he could say more, a commotion erupted from the lobby. It was Arthur, his voice raw with desperation, arguing with the desk sergeant, demanding to see the person in charge. Several officers converged on Arthur, trying to calm him down. Sir, you need to lower your voice. Let's just sit down and talk about this. But Arthur was beyond reason. Decades of quiet dignity had been stripped away, leaving only the frantic energy of a man with nothing left to lose. He was shouting, waving his arms, accusing them of negligence. To the casual observer, he looked exactly like what they thought he was, an unhinged old man. Suddenly he gasped, clutching his chest. His face went ashen, and he staggered back. A wave of panic went through the officers. "Whoa, take it easy, old-timer," one of them said, grabbing his arm to steady him. "Let's get you a chair. Someone call for an ambulance." "No ambulance," Arthur wheezed, fumbling in his coat pocket. "I have my pills." He pulled out a worn leather wallet, his trembling fingers struggling to open the clasp. He was trying to get to a small plastic baggie of nitroglycerin tablets tucked inside. As he pulled the baggie out, his clumsy fingers dislodged a small, laminated photograph. It fluttered from the wallet and landed face up on the polished floor, directly at the feet of Captain Davis, who had come out of his office to see what the source of the chaos was. "Here, let me help you with that," Davis said, bending down. He picked up the small bag of pills and the photograph. He handed the pills to Arthur, but his eyes were glued to the photo. The world around him seemed to fade away. The noise of the precinct, the frantic officers, Arthur's laboured breathing, it all disappeared. He stared at the image of a young man in an army dress uniform, his gaze direct and confident, a small, proud smile on his lips. Captain Davis's blood ran cold. His face turned pale and his hand began to shake. Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice a choked whisper. Arthur, having placed a pill under his tongue, felt the sharp pain in his chest begin to subside. He looked up at the police captain, confused by the man's intense reaction. That's my son, Michael," he said, his voice still weak. "He was an army lieutenant." Michael. Davis breathed the name like a prayer. He felt the phantom heat of a desert sun on his face, the taste of dust in his mouth. He was 19 again, a terrified private huddled behind a rock wall in the Korangal Valley, bullets whizzing over his head. A young, fearless lieutenant was yelling encouragement, moving from soldier to soldier, his presence a beacon of calm in the storm of chaos. "Stay with me, Private Davis! We're getting out of this!" that lieutenant had yelled, just before shoving him out of the path of an incoming RPG. That lieutenant was Michael Miller. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. The final firefight. They were pinned down, outnumbered. A grenade landed in the middle of their small group. It didn't explode, but the pin was gone. It was a dud, but nobody knew that. They all froze, accepting their fate. But Lieutenant Miller didn't freeze. Without a moment's hesitation, he dove onto the grenade, covering it with his body to shield his men. He had died instantly, sacrificing himself for a squad of teenagers who barely knew how to shave, one of whom was Igor Davis, now captain of the 19th District. He was my CO, Davis said, his voice thick with emotion, his eyes locked on the photo. He saved my life. He saved all of our lives. The other officers in the lobby fell silent, stunned. The crazy old crank was the father of a hero, the father of the man their captain owed his life to. Captain Davis looked from the photograph to Arthur's weary, grief-stricken face. A profound sense of shame washed over him. "Sir," he said, his voice now filled with a deep, unwavering respect. "I am so sorry for everything." He gently took Arthur by the arm. "Please, Mr. Miller, come with me to my office. Let's talk." He led the stunned old man past the silent, gawking officers and into the privacy of his office. He closed the door behind them. The other cops exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't just dismissed an old man's complaint. They had failed the father of a man who had made the ultimate sacrifice. The guilt in the room was palpable. Inside the office, Davis poured Arthur a glass of water, and for the next hour, he didn't interrogate him. He just listened. He listened to the story of the noise, the harassment, the threats, and the complete dismissal by his own department. "Mr. Miller, I give you my word, this stops today," Davis said, his voice hard as steel. "The officers who ignored your complaints will be dealt with. But first, we are going to deal with your neighbours." He immediately assigned his best detective to the case. This was no longer a minor nuisance complaint. It was a targeted harassment case, and he was taking it personally. They obtained a warrant for surveillance. A discreet camera was installed in the hallway ceiling, and the listening device was placed inside Arthur's apartment near the shared wall. They didn't have to wait long. That very night the devices captured everything. The window-rattling music, Kyle's drunken shouting, and Jessica's voice clear as day, whispering cruel threats through the mail slot. The next morning, the evidence was on Captain Davis's desk. It was undeniable, and it was sickening. Jessica and Kyle were brought into the station for questioning. They swaggered in, confident and smug, assuming it was another routine noise complaint they could brush off. They were separated and placed in 2 different interrogation rooms. When the detective played the recordings for them, the colour drained from their faces. Their smirks vanished, replaced by fear. They were facing serious charges: harassment, stalking, making criminal threats. Captain Davis asked Arthur to come to the station. He wanted him to have the satisfaction of seeing this through. He brought Arthur into the room where a pale, trembling Jessica was sitting. "I just have one question, Jessica," Arthur said, his voice quiet but steady. "Why? Why all this hatred? What did I ever do to you?" Jessica's face crumpled. The bravado was gone, replaced by a raw, childish anger. "What did you do?" she shrieked, tears streaming down her face. "It's because of your son. My mother's entire life was ruined because of your perfect son, Michael." Arthur was completely taken aback. "Michael? He and your mother were friends. I don't understand." "Friends?" She laughed, a hysterical, broken sound. "A week before she died, my mother confessed everything to me. She told me that I'm his daughter. Michael Miller is my biological father." The room fell silent. Arthur stared at her, his mind reeling. A daughter. Michael had a daughter. He was a grandfather. The words didn't seem real. He looked at Jessica, truly looked at her for the first time, and beneath the anger and the makeup, he could see it. The shape of her eyes, the line of her jaw. It was Michael. She was telling the truth. A detective in the room, confused, interjected. "Wait a minute. You knew this man was your biological grandfather, and you still tormented him like this. Why?" Kyle, who had been brought into the room, answered for her with a greasy smirk. "It's simple, officer. We figured, after he died, from all the stress, she could prove the DNA connection. As his only living heir, she'd inherit the apartment. We wanted the whole floor, remember?" The sheer, cold-blooded callousness of the plan hung in the air. Arthur felt his legs go weak. All this cruelty, this torment was for his apartment, from his own granddaughter. "Svetlana, Jessica," he whispered, his voice cracking. "If you had just told me, if you had just come to me and told me the truth, I would have given you everything." He looked at the girl who was his own flesh and blood, and felt nothing but a vast, empty sorrow. He turned and walked out of the room without another word. The charges against Jessica and Kyle stuck. They received hefty fines, probation, and a restraining order that forced them to move out immediately. Kyle sold his adjacent apartment and disappeared. The building fell quiet. A few weeks later, a young couple, David and Sarah, moved into the unit Kyle had vacated. They were both public school teachers, and they had 2 small children, whose happy squeals and laughter now echoed in the hallway. The sound was like music to Arthur's ears. They were kind, respectful people who would often check in on him, bringing him groceries or just stopping by to chat. He learned they drove 2 hours every weekend to visit Sarah's aging parents in rural Illinois, as they couldn't afford a place for them in the city. The story touched Arthur's heart. He saw in them a decency and kindness that felt like a balm on his wounded spirit. A month later, Arthur Miller passed away peacefully in his sleep. When his will was read, the community was surprised. He had left his prized apartment, not to his newly discovered granddaughter, but to David and Sarah, the young teachers next door, giving them a permanent home in the city and a chance to bring their parents closer. For Jessica, he left only a small sealed box. Inside there were just 3 things: Michael's silver star and purple heart, the laminated photograph of him in his lieutenant's uniform, and a short handwritten note. It contained only 5 words. This was your father. Try to be worthy of him. It was his final lesson, not as a teacher, but as a grandfather. A final, poignant plea for a legacy of honour to overcome a legacy of greed. In the end, Arthur found his peace, but not before delivering one last, powerful lesson. His legacy wasn't in his bloodline, but in the kindness he chose to reward. The shocking revelation of his granddaughter didn't change his character, it solidified it. He chose to give his home not to the family he had, but to the family that deserved it. He left Jessica not with property, but with the heavy weight of her father's heroism, a moral inheritance she would have to carry for the rest of her life. Arthur's story is a powerful reminder that our true legacy is defined by our actions, not our blood. Thank you for joining us for this incredible story. If it touched your heart, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And let us know in the comments, what do you think is more important, blood ties or the bonds of kindness?